All right, welcome to mixed use in the building code, especially as it applies to fire ratings. So for today's 40 minutes of competence presented by the Amber Book, we're going to go ahead and answer the following question. Define these code concepts and identify the difference between them. We have incidental use, accessory use, non-separated occupancy, and separated occupancy. So what you're going to do is, if you have a mixed-use building or a building where more than one thing happens in it, you're going to have to choose one of these four paths. You're going to have to choose one of these four paths. So if you have, say you have a office, say it's an accountant's office, a pretty sleek accountant's office, and then maybe behind this wall here on our right is a boiler room because they need heating in that office. So that boiler room is going to be, as you might imagine, more of a life safety threat than the office itself. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we can call that, as long as that boiler room is less than 10% of the floor area, we can call that boiler room an incidental use. Why can we call it an incidental use? Because it's on this particular table of incidental uses. So if it's smaller than 10% of the total area of, in our case, the office, we have a B occupancy class because we have a business, we have an accountant's office, but we have something that's much more combustible in our boiler room, much more combustion going on, much more gases going on, that kind of thing. And so what we can do is, if it happens to be under this incidental uses table, then we can do what we will do. We will have to do whatever this table tells us. Now, it used to be for incidental use, there was a little bit more flexibility. The code official could decide what was incidental use and what wasn't, but the code officials didn't like that. They wanted a little bit more clarity from the code council, and this is what they got when they got it. So we can see here rooms with boilers where the largest piece of equipment is over 15 psi and 10 horsepower. In that case, we have to provide a separation of 1 hour or provide an automatic sprinkler system, and that's for the incidental use room, so for the room with a boiler. So if we had a furnace instead of a boiler, and if you don't know the difference between a furnace and a furnace heats air and a boiler heats water. If we had a refrigerant machinery room, say we had a grocery store with a refrigerant machinery room, this tells us what to do, because we need a refrigerant machinery room perhaps for all the freezers and refrigerators in the grocery store. If we have a paint shop, like a physical plant shop that's in a nursing home, if we have a chemistry lab that's in a high school, if we have a laundry room in a hotel, these kind of really common mixed use scenarios where we have one thing next to or inside of another, and it's not too big relative to the big thing, the primary occupancy, we have to do whatever this table tells us to. Now, this is pretty specific. So if you don't happen to have one of those adjacencies, then you have to go through one of the other three paths. So if behind this wall, instead of behind this wall was something as specific as a boiler, let's say it was just a storage area. And let's say it was a storage area that was less than 10% of the total area of the floor. And let's say it was a storage area that was used by the primary occupant, by the accounting office. So they used it to store old files and records. And so as such, we normally would say, well, a storage area is you have to meet a higher threshold. It's more restrictive in the code because of all the content that could burn. But in fact, if we meet those two criteria, if the storage area is used or whatever the other, we have a B here, business here for the accountant's office, and we have an S on the other side of this wall for storage, but we don't have to consider the secondary occupancy really too much. I'll explain in a minute. But if it's less than 10% of the total floor area, and it's used by the primary occupant, the accounting office, then we can call this an accessory use, or accessory occupancy. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we don't have to spend a lot of money and we don't have to jump through as many hoops. So as an accessory use, because it's less than 10% and because it's used by the primary user, we can go ahead and treat it in parts of the code like it's just one big B occupancy. So when we're trying to figure out the size limits or the height limits, the area limits, the construction type, we can just kind of call the whole thing B. Of course, there are exceptions. It is not worth learning the exceptions generally for the exam. I don't think that the exam gives you a lot of the kind of weird exceptions, but there are cases where you have a high hazard storage. So if your accounting office is also for some reason used for storing fireworks, then obviously we want to have separation between the two because it's so flammable. Likewise, if we have an institutional occupancy as our primary, like a hospital or a prison where someone can't get out, we need more time to let them out, and we may, even if it's small storage area, we may need a separation. But we're not going to worry too much about those. So we can call that an accessory use. As an accessory use, we don't have to provide a barrier, a fire-rated barrier. Now, if this storage area, this S over here, is more than 10% of the floor area of this office, or let's say that the landlord who rents out to the accounting firm uses a storage area. So it's no longer being, even if it's less than 10%, if it's not being used by these guys here in the accounting office for their own storage of accounting stuff, say that the landlord has maybe an eBay business and uses the storage on his commercial building for his eBay business for storing merchandise that he's buying and selling in arbitrage, then he needs to make sure that he chooses one of two options. And those options are either going to be a non-separated occupancy or a separated occupancy. So these two are less than 10%, and the same person is using both occupancies. The incidental use is a very specific list. The accessory use is anything else that would not be classified as the same type of occupancy as the primary occupancy. So that takes care of these. And for everything else, if you have a mixed-use building, say you have a restaurant and a restaurant in an apartment building, or if you have a storage area that's bigger than 10% of the building, then you have to choose between these two. Who chooses? The designer or the owner get to choose. You get to choose. You have to choose one of these four if you have any kind of mixed use situation, or if you have two different types of spaces. All right. Now, what's the difference between non-separated and separated occupancy, and when do you use one versus the other? All right. If you have a non-separated occupancy, then that means that this wall right here that separates the accounting office from its storage room, or from the landlord's storage room, either one, its big storage room, or the landlord's small storage room, or the landlord's big storage room, that wall then has to be fire rated per the code that we looked at before. But as a non-separated occupancy, if you choose the path of non-separated occupancy, you don't have to separate the two. So the landlord's storage and the big 20% of the floor area storage for the accounting office, if you choose the non-separated path, then you don't have to rate those barriers so that they meet all the requirements. Now, is that good? Yeah, it's nice not to have to. You always can, But if you have to, not only do you have to assemble it in a way that has been tested to meet the number of hours that the table requires you to meet, but all penetrations from pipes and conduit and ducts have to be sealed. You have to put smoke dampers inside the duct to make sure it doesn't move its way through. The smoke doesn't move its way through. You have to seal around the perimeter and so forth. All kinds of fire stop. It's just pretty difficult. Now, what's the catch? What's the catch? The catch is now we have most of the building that's B and some of the building that's S. And the catch is, if you choose not to separate them, you have to treat the whole building as if it's the more restrictive occupancy type. So you have to treat the whole building as S, because in most cases S is more restrictive than B. And when you have to do that, like under what conditions? Well, you have to do that when you're figuring out the construction type. So you know that, you may know that to figure out construction type, which is essentially, there's kind of a three-legged stool, right? One leg of the stool is the occupancy type, one leg of the stool is the size of the building, and one leg of the stool is the construction type. And typically the occupancy type is not really up to you. It's kind of up to whatever the program says the building is going to be. And if your occupancy type doesn't happen to be on the list, you have to choose, often in consultation with the code official, you have to choose an occupancy type that is closest to what the established other examples of rooms is. So for instance, if it winds up that we find out that COVID is neutralized by spending 2 hours in a room made of marshmallows, you would have to somehow figure out what occupancy in the code is closest to a room made of marshmallows, and because obviously the code doesn't already have a room constructed of marshmallows as one of the kind of multiple choice types of rooms that you can choose. Anyhow, if you have this office building, now when you're trying to figure out how big it can be for a given construction type, you no longer probably can use B, because most likely it depends on the construction type, but most likely the S is the one that's more restrictive. So if the S is more restrictive and it says you can only be 3 floors instead of 5, you have to use the S if you chose the non-separated, or you have to go to a higher level of non-combustibility in the construction. Likewise, if the code says you can do it with 20,000, if the code says each floor can be up to 20,000 square feet with B, but only 10,000 square feet if the building was S, you have to limit the whole building to 10,000 square feet, because it's not fair to not separate the two and then get to choose the one that's more lenient. So that is the non-separated path. Non-separated path. If you have a situation where you have 2 different occupancies in mixed use, and one of them is bigger than 10%, or they have 2 different tenants, that's slightly more common. That's more common to choose the more common to choose the non-separated, because generally that little storage room or whatever won't push you over to the next higher level of non-combustibility and construction type. However, it's not uncommon that you would prefer to choose the separated occupancy. The separated occupancy. So instead of non-separated, now you're saying, okay, it's separated. And that's what we looked at in a previous version of 40 Minutes of Competence, where we say, okay, we have our business, and we have our storage, and we have to go ahead and figure out what the two of them are, what the separation is in hours between the two of them. And then we're going to have to move from there. So what do we do in a separated occupancy? Well, in a separated occupancy, what we're going to do is we're going to use the occupancy between the walls between the occupants, between the two occupancy types, are going to have to meet that table, the number of hours that it's rated, and in our calculation of construction type, we can use construction type this for the B and construction type that for the S. We can use sprinkler, whether it's sprinklered or not for the B, whether it's sprinklered or not for the S. So if the S has to be sprinklered, we don't have to sprinkler the whole building, we just have to sprinkler the storage area. And we can use the whole building as needed. Now, when we do that, as you might imagine, there's all kinds of loopholes and exceptions. I wouldn't worry about learning them for the exam, but just know that, for instance, if you have apartment dwellings, they have to be separated. You can't choose the non-separated option between dwellings. Likewise, if you, there's all kinds of little exceptions, as you might imagine. But generally, that's the takeaway. All right. So, for next week's 40 minutes of competence, this is our question. I need you to identify, and for the exam, probably just memorize these 5 standards. ASTM E1527, ASTM E1903, ASHRAE 55, ASHRAE 62, and ASHRAE 90.1. So there are still places, fewer than there used to be, but there's still lots of places in the exam that you just need to memorize things, and you can, of course, feel free to look those up if you don't already know them. So this last one you may know. That's probably the most common in discussions around the design table. But you need to just memorize those for the exam. So we'll go over them next week. Now is the time where those of you who are ready to go study can go study, and the rest of you, I encourage you to stick around and ask me questions or listen and lurk while others ask me questions. So we will reconvene in a few minutes. Oh, before you shout out questions, let me go over the last week's chat questions. So there were 3 or 4 of them, but I chose these 2 to go over. One of them I kind of put aside for a future 40 minutes of competence or maybe a future flashcard. But the first is, are Sabins cubic feet per second? No, they are not. The unit of Sabins is a unit of sound absorption. You might remember we get Sabins by taking the surface area of each material, say wood, and we multiply it by the absorption coefficient of wood. Now the exam calls the absorption coefficient, this is SAC for sound absorption coefficient, but you'll take the surface area and multiply it by the sound absorption coefficient. The sound absorption coefficient is unitless because it's a percentage. It's the total sound energy absorbed and transmitted over the total incident sound energy. So it's one of those numbers that ranges between 0 and 1, and it is unitless, and then so what we're left with is square feet. And so Sabins, the reason you can think of it as square feet, if you have a room with 750 Sabins, then that means you have a room that, in terms of how long sound lingers as if it was a completely sound reflective room, theoretically completely sound reflective room with no absorption, and then you had a 750 square foot being the operative answer here, 750 square feet of opening, of just window where the sound just leaves. The next question someone asked, so this is square feet is the unit of Sabins. But usually when we talk about Sabins, we just talk about Sabins as the unit. So if I was, as an acoustical consultant, if I was talking about Sabins, I wouldn't say we have 750 square feet of Sabins. I would say we have 750 Sabins. And it's named after Wallace Clement Sabin, which has an E on the end, but the unit actually does not have an E. It's S-A-B-I-N-S. All right, the other question that was asked, it says, can you explain the location of a transformer and switchgear for different types of buildings, specifically in regards to the property line? Well, a transformer can be in one of several places. In above ground, like residential, you'll see it on the pole. It'll be a little, like a drum on the pole. It'll be like a little cylinder. And the transformer, of course, steps down the voltage so that it can go, we can distribute it high voltage around a city or a municipality or around a region or the country. And then we need low voltage for safety reasons inside the building. So the transformer will step that down. Sometimes the transformer will actually be inside the building, often in a basement. But in the context of what you're asking with regards to the property line, we're probably talking about a underground buried line, and that's the transformer there. So this is my house. I just took this picture like an hour ago. And so what you're talking about is on the street, we usually bury the electrical line 4 feet back. So it's going to be 4 feet off the edge of the property line in that dimension. And it's often, though not always, on the property line between my neighbor's house and my house. So this is where it would go, I guess, if you were to see it on a test. Often. This is actually right outside my window right now. I'm looking at it. What you're looking at on the screen, I'm actually looking at my window pretty much in my office. And here again, you see that the underground buried line is going to be 4 feet off the property line, and that's the transformer for this former school, now university building. Used to be a high school way back when. And I don't know where the property line is there, but I suspect it's there. And so the rest of that is kind of easement or something like that, because it's kind of a park in front of it. But I don't know that. But generally it's going to be 4 feet off the property line. Now, as far as switchgear goes, switchgear, you'll remember, is equipment that allows, if you've done the Amber book, you'll remember, switchgear is equipment that is kind of like a breaker, but it's a breaker that you don't have to touch you don't have to be near the electricity. You don't have to be near the power moving through, the current. So basically, if you have a situation where you have a big building like this one right here, it has a lot of juice, it has a lot of watts, it has a lot of amps and going to the building. And in the event of a fire, you don't want the firemen in the dark, in the basement, in a building they're not that familiar with, standing in a puddle of water because, you know, electrically conducting 3 inches of water in the basement because the fire hoses have been trained on the building for, 3 hours while they were putting out the flames. And you want the fireman to be able to turn off the power without having to get his fingers too near the breaker. And so the electrical breaker that you have in your house, it's not that big a deal because there's not that much power going through it. It's not quite as dangerous. But in a big building like this, you don't want him going near it. So the switchgear is these kind of cabinets that basically have a switch outside the cabinet that disconnect the real breaker inside the cabinet. And the switchgear is always located the instant, like right at the moment where the electrical line goes into the building. So it's always upstream of the rest of the building because you wouldn't want the fireman to turn off the switchgear and think everything was off, but there was something upstream of that switchgear that was still live. So you want everything downstream of the switchgear to be turn offable by the switchgear itself. And remember, the switchgear we're talking about is a cabinet. How big is the switchgear? I don't know. It's somewhere the size. It's maybe somewhere the size of an armoire for a small one, and for the big ones, they may be the height of an armoire and a half, and they may be the length of 2 large living rooms, kind of in length. So that's kind of the range of size for the switchgear that I've seen. But anyhow, assuming that this transformer is serving this building, likely there's now lower voltage power coming into the building here, and you would locate the switchgear right at the moment it went in the building. Because it turns out that burying power lines is expensive, and doing it in an inefficient way is dangerous too, because you don't want it going everywhere. You want to make sure it's protected. So generally, the side of the building that is nearest to the transformer will be where the power enters the building, and where the power enters the building is where those metal cabinets are. And those cabinets, by code, they need 3 feet clear in front of them and 6 feet clear in height. So in other words, the fireman, and when everything's dark and smoky, has to be able to get to the switchgear without having to move a bunch of things out of the way, or without having to squeeze in a really tight space with his oxygen and all of his equipment.